Our first speaker for this session is Ian Thompson. He's going to speak to us on how is quantum physics really connected to consciousness. And let me tell you a little bit about him. He is a nuclear physicist and student of Swedenborg. He is a fellow of the Institute of Physics of London and fellow of the American Physical Society. He was previously professor of physics at the University of Surrey in the UK and is currently employed at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. He has written Starting Science from God. Here's a copy, and these are also for sale out in the atrium. And maintains many websites on Swedenborgian subjects with a homepage at ianthompson.org. So would you please welcome Ian Thompson.
Okay, so this is a project we have which follows on from this book. I want to work out more details about the interface between spirit and physics, between mind and matter. That's what now we have a theistic science group which we meet Zoom every Monday. Andy is part of that. And if you're interested in knowing a little bit more about theistic science, I wrote a little leaflet of which there are more copies out there. But now I'm going to focus on a particular feature of, or a process, the sensory level of the mind. The sensory level of the mind is the outermost spiritual one, just before you get to the physical level. And so we want to, and when we see things, somehow the sensory mind gets information from physics, and we want to know how that's done. What would the principles of Swedenborg tell us about the operation of this? And so the way I'm going to do it is to look at two problems that are presently unsolved in science. The first one is the quantum measurement problem. If you've done any quantum physics at school or at college, you will have heard about this problem, and also in the popular discussions. But I'm going to use the green font when I talk about the quantum measurement problem. But related to that, there's a particular function that the sensory mind does, which is that it quickly recognizes external objects. When I move my eye around, I can see a bit of metal on the floor, I can see a cup, I can see a person very quickly. And when I look at all of you together, my visual field has a lot of detail. It has all of you people. But if you work out the information space in the visual cortex of the brain, there's not nearly enough neurons to describe all that information. So there are some unsolved problems. And there are some what I call materialist or mechanical proposals to try and to solve these, so I'll outline briefly. And after that, I'm going to show what principles we have from the writings, from Swedenborg's heavenly doctrines, which would lead us to a proper solution. And the way we're going to proceed is to remember that the sensory mind and the brain are distinct, discrete degrees. And so we use the principles that couple multiple discrete degrees together, influx and correspondences and things like that. So we'll discuss that. And then I'm going to take these principles and I'm going to make a leap, as the previous speaker did, starting again from the principles and trying to solve a problem, that the quantum measurement problem, and more specifically, how we recognize external objects. And so this ends up with a proposal for a new interface between mental and physical degrees, which has some kind of asymmetric joint measurements events, that I call them, which in principle can be tested scientifically by looking at how people recognize objects. So I'm going to summarize in a few slides at the beginning here what the two problems are that I'm trying to solve. The quantum measurement problem has very simplistic ways of being presented sometimes, like, our consciousness creates reality. But I'm going to be more specific here. I'm going to remind us that a classical wave, such as a wave on an ocean or a pond or a sound wave, affects everywhere where it goes. My voice travels to all the people in the room, and you all hear the sounds that I make. But a quantum wave spreads out, but it only affects one person or one point in the domain. So it's like if you have a photographic plate and an electron going towards it as one single electron, only one grain gets exposed in a photographic plate, not all of the grains, even though the electron is in some sense interacting with all of them. So this problem is called the reduction of the wave packet, or the selection of actual outcome, or how you reduce superpositions of alternatives to only one thing actually occurring. So that's, I'll briefly list some of the illustrious names that have been used to propose possible solutions to this problem. It's still unsolved. You can think of there's a maximum distance in the wave, and it can't spread out too much, but that's not true because light from stars spreads out over a whole galaxy. It's still, sometimes people think of maximum energy difference or maximum gravitational energy difference and so on, or maybe there's some spontaneous new mechanism. So I wrote some time ago a book about all of this discussion about quantum physics and philosophy of nature. And chapter 12 of that discusses these. But the trouble is that these have been proposed, but all of them have been none of them have been supported by experiments. It's actually very difficult to find any limit experimentally. So it's an unsolved problem. Physicists do not yet know when quantum measurements or reduction of the wave packet occurs. The other problem in blue here is the sensory problem of recognizing objects. Humans and animals, frogs, flies, every animal, at least animals, is able to recognize objects, a fly, no matter how fast it's moving, well, within range. And does it very quickly, within 1/10 of a second. And you could think of it as the problem of for humans recognizing a car. Each of across the top row are cars at various distances, orientations, angles, backgrounds. They all can be recognized as cars, and the lower ones are not cars. So this is done you would think, in the outermost sensory mind, because even a 1-year-old baby or probably 6 months can pick up something. They can notice specific objects. And so there are two main proposals that have been put forward in science, in sort of sensory psychology. One of them is to take the scene and then you work out where the color changes, the light changes, then you work out lines, then you combine the lines into areas, and then you combine the areas and somehow into objects. It's like progressive abstraction of details. And finally, you end up with a 3D objects. And this is used a lot in what's called artificial neural networks. They follow this strategy. An alternative one, that's a sort of a bottom-up strategy. You start with the image and you end up with an idea, some ideas of the objects. The top-down strategy is you have a model of what table is, what a chair is, what a person is, and you adjust the parameters of the model until it predicts a view which is close to what we view. And this is more popular in psychology in the last 10 years or so. I could give references. But both of these kinds require a lot of neural computation. So in a very fast computer, you could do 1,000 million steps, and you could possibly do something like this. But in a brain, there's only time for about 100 steps. So there's enough neurons in the brain to do these things, but getting them to coordinate quickly enough is still a difficult problem. So I'm going to think from what the writings are and try and come up with a solution for these problems together. Okay, so it's a little challenge, but as I said, I've been thinking about it. This was written 10 years ago, and I discovered there's a paragraph in here in which I suggest something along the lines that I'm now developing. So our theistic science group is having fun talking through these things and filling out all the details. So the principles we're going to use are that the physical and the mental are distinct, discrete degrees. I think we recognize that. And I'm not using the word natural because the word natural is used by Swedenborg to refer to the outermost mind, which is what I'm calling sensory. So You might think that nature refers to physical, but Swedenborg uses the word natural in a rather specific sense, so I do not use the word natural to avoid confusion. And these two discrete degrees are next to each other in some sense, and so the influx goes from the mental into the physical. So this, and you notice it goes from the mental into the physical, but now I've got the problem of sensation as how to get information from the physical to the mental. So there's a problem just from that fact that influx is from the top down. That immediately poses a problem from the Swedenborgian point of view of how sensory perception, how the sensory mind gets any information at all. So this is the problem that I'm trying to solve. I have to solve that problem within Swedenborg's writings. Well, it's not really a problem because we'll come to some features later. But the point is this influx occurs and then it produces correspondences. Correspondences are patterns of similar functions. So if you see patterns of similar functions, that's sort of a footprint that influx occurred because influx generates patterns of similar functions. And then at the bottom here, we have from the psychology and the neurologists of science today, the sensory mind and the visual cortex are very closely connected. Of course, they think that the sensory mind, it just is the operation of the visual cortex. That's the materialist approach. But we know that at least we should say that they're closely connected. And therefore, if things are closely connected, we would expect many correspondences between them. And so we're going to see if there are correspondences. Now, just to put us in the picture of where the sensory mind is, as a reminder, this is N.C. Burnham wrote a wonderful book 150 years ago of all discrete degrees. And this is chapter 13, in which he has inmost where the soul is, then he has celestial, the three heavens, and then he has three external mind, and then the sensual or the sensory mind is this F here. So it's the lowermost part of the external mind, and quantum mechanics is the outermost part of physics. So we might think that there are correspondences there. But now, when we look at the functions when we look at what quantum selections do in quantum mechanics, and we look at which are in green, and when we look at what sensory selections do in the mind, in the sensory mind, there's a lot of similarities. There's a lot of correspondences even. So let's look at some of these. Number one is both the green and the red, both the quantum and the sensory selections select from many alternatives that are already there in some sense. A quantum wave function spreads out over many possible alternatives that many grains on a photographic plate. The wave function is there, but only one of them is selected. So the wave function gives you tells you the probability of which one is selected. And in the sensory mind, a 1-month-old baby cannot recognize objects. It has no experience to build on. So we recognize things that we've seen before. So it's something like memory, but normally it's not a personal memory. It's an archive of experience, shall we say, that build up in young children, which enables them, after playing with things and seeing what three-dimensional objects are and so on, there's an archive of experience, and which is built up. So, and this experience tells us something to do with the appearance of things, and there's many ways of arranging things, as I said earlier. The things we see can be far or near. If I walk across the room, the size of the cup that I see doesn't vary, even though it's getting very bigger and bigger on my retina, for example. And the cup can be rotated, it can be in different lighting. So each of those rotations or movements or speeds, a cup moving is still a cup. Each of those can be regarded as a different dimension for describing what's seen. And the sensory mind still recognizes things, even though all of these variations are possible. So there's lots of dimensions. And then the selection seems to be very fast. the outcome just pops into existence. So if I look across the room and I see a picture, I wasn't expecting to see a picture there, but as soon as I see it, I recognize it as a picture. So the sensory selection is very fast, and it seems to be a lot faster than you would allow from if it was just neurons doing it, so in the brain. So this is and as I said at the bottom here, you recognize dangerous objects very quickly. And think of a frog trying to recognize a fly going past. This is a classical example. It shoots out its long tongue and picks a fly which is moving around in an amazing way. So things must be very fast. So if we look at that list on the previous page, there seem to be corresponding features of quantum observations and sensory observations. So there's one difference. Quantum events are random, but sensory events are determined. So there's a feature that in which they're significant, important feature in which they're different. So we'll come back to that later. So that has to be resolved. So what I'm suggesting, or what I want to go on to suggest at the bottom here, is that perhaps there's an influx from the sensory mind into the brain such that there's a sensory selection and a quantum selection occurring at the same time, because the influx, the sensory mind produces influx, and then that creates a quantum measurement. And so I'm not going to go through all the steps here, but I'm going to propose so if there is correspondence between the sensory mind and quantum processes, that means that their principles of operation have a lot of similarity because their operations correspond to each other, the details and the functions. So that would mean that the sensory mind behaves in some way like quantum processes. And so I'm using that. I'm now going to do, what I'm going to do is I'm going to think from quantum physics to the sensory mind using correspondences. Because my professional day job is in quantum mechanics, I'm able to do that. And I end up proposing what I call a quantum epistemic engine, but it's quantum-like for a reason which we'll come to in a minute. And the reason that it's quantum-like is that if we just took that proposal, this randomness problem comes back to bite us, because in normal quantum physics, there are very many possible outcomes and they're selected randomly. But when in the sensory mind sees many things that it could see and selects one of them, but it's determined by what comes from the mind. So there's a speed difference due to the randomness of quantum physics, but there's not a randomness in the sensory mind in the same way. But however, we have to remember something else from the writings, is that an outermost degree is a terminating and fixed degree. This is a feature which we tend to forget. And an outermost degree makes itself a foundation or a plane for higher degrees to rest on. So in this case, the outer degree is the quantum level, and the one inside it is the sensory mind. So this outer degree is not a self-conscious, it's actually a physical degree. So this suggestion leads to the bottom two bullets here, that the outermost physical is the location of definite quantum selections as effects or uses. And then the outermost physical, which is the quantum one, contains or constrains the degree inside it. The fact that the outermost degree contains or constrains, which is a Swedenborgian New Church principle, means this is how information gets sent from the sensory mind, from the quantum brain into the sensory mind, even though, as we said earlier, the influx only comes down. So there's influx coming down, but there's a constraining or selection process from the outermost degree, which can be used, as in this case, to send information back up the chain. So for those of you who remember, the kingdom of the will is coming, operation coming down, but the kingdom of the lungs, or this wisdom or sensing, is information going up. So both of these operations are needed. So I'm going to do something which I wouldn't do if I was just a physicist. I'm going to say that this quantum-like system, which I'm using to model the sensory mind, is not purely or normal quantum physics. It's not behaving randomly. I'm going to say that the probability of outcomes in the sensory mind is determined by the degree just outside it, which is the brain. So this is what I call these. So there are measurement events. They're joint because it's the same event between the sensory mind and the quantum degree, and it's asymmetric because the outermost degree constrains the one inside. So the influx from the sensory mind generates the event, and the particular outcome selects. So you got information. That's how information goes up the chain, which is otherwise difficult to understand from the pure New Church doctrine, unless you remember about outer degrees constraining inner degrees. So what this does is that by using correspondences and seeing that the sensory mind in some ways and some features corresponds to the quantum mechanical processes in physics, then I can use this to think in a new way about the sensory mind. I begin to understand some of the details of what goes on in the sensory mind. It's not exactly quantum mechanical because of this constraining thing changes the probabilities. So we end up with a more specific idea about the interface between two discrete degrees, because that's the purpose of this project, is to see how the two discrete degrees are coupled together. And this, so it's not just correspondences by itself, it's influx, which generates an event on a lower degree, and then the outcome of the lower degree event constrains what happens in the upper degree. So to end with, I'll just draw a little picture here of a schematic of the processes involved in so we have a physical world, we can see a table, comes through the eyes, and then we have this quantum mechanical epistemic engine, which takes all the possible things, and then there's a joint event which selects a particular table that's seen. So this is just a little schematic, pictorial way of trying to imagine how the sensory mind works. So it's neither the bottom-up or the top-down procedure that the cognitive psychologists or computational psychologists have thought of. So it's a one based on the writings using ideas of influx and constraint, which together can teach us something that we wouldn't otherwise have known. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And we have a few minutes for questions or comments.
Ian, would you describe what you mean by mental light? Because this is something I think we've discussed on many Mondays, and I'm still not entirely clear what we've been talking about.
Yes, well, mental light comes from, okay, I haven't said where it comes from, have I?
No.
Do you know, does the audience know where mental light comes from? The mental sun. Does that ring a bell? Ultimately, it's the fact that there is influx from the Lord, which enables us to see things. But normally, there's light in this room. Some of it's from the outside, but we don't normally work out where it comes from. But okay, it's needed because in quantum physics there are wave functions which are like little objects with uncertain positions. In order to see what the view is, in order to if I have an idea of a table, in order to work out how it appears, you have to imagine some light shining on your idea of a table, and then you can imagine that the top is brighter than the legs, for example. So you need something like mental light in order to work out from the general idea of a table how a specific table would appear. And so you know that if there's light underneath, you know something's unusual has happened. Okay, and then Andy.
Yeah, so I be curious about how you would describe spiritual experience, because if it's the altitude degree of the brain is constraining or containing the sensory mind,
Yes.
and then imagine the sensory mind is still involved in spiritual experience. Do you see that as just the constraint being taken away somehow?
Well, there's a whole lot of degrees above, as we saw from that Burnham diagram, and so the things that our sensory mind is that degree is where the literal sense of the word is, for example. So there's something important about that degree, even when you're in the spiritual world. The word in the spiritual world is written by means of pictures in this degree, and when we're living in the body, the sensory mind is connected to our brain. Most of us very rarely have spiritual experiences, but after we're separated, then the sensory mind is detached from the brain, and then it's driven almost entirely by influx. So the sensory mind, when you're in the spiritual world, just portrays what your loves and your higher loves are. It's like a free floating scenery. So
what do you think might be happening in the natural world with spiritual experience? Like
the natural spiritual experience in the natural world require withdrawing a little bit from the senses. Do you remember Swedenborg says that if you're stuck with the sensory mind, you'll never understand spiritual things properly. And so I'm describing the degree which we have to escape in order to think rationally. So, but we have to understand that, because that's the foundation. I mean, this is just the beginning of understanding a series of discrete degrees. Andy, and then Dan.
Well, just quickly, most of us can understand quantum mechanics easier by this comparison. But for you, you're going to understand the quantum mechanics to see how
Yes,
it works.
yes.
And the other thing is, a table is actually not a physical object. It's something we use. And in all of this use is a very important thing.
Indeed.
To recognize.
Yes, the psychologists have the phrase affordances, which is all the things you can do with a table. And in order to be useful, in order for this process to be useful, you have to know what you can do with a table. And so therefore, this is really the outermost degree of the sensory mind, because a child, when he or she plays with objects, the baby learns what you can do with objects. That's just as important as learning to recognize them. So,
really interesting talk. Thank you. Sean's comment brings to mind a passage in Heaven and Hell where Swedenborg is emphasizing that living a spiritual life means being engaged with the world rather than withdrawing from it. And he talks about some people hermits and things like that, who do withdraw from it, and when they're deprived from sensory input, they then seem to have either hallucinations or spiritual experiences or something like that. So that meeting point, if you withdraw one side, interesting things happen on the
Well, I haven't really discussed the will. So I gave a talk last year at another conference about how operations of will can affect physical things. So that's the downward flow, which is you need to do in your life. All your intentions that come into action, you need to have them. So I'm just describing one small part. So you agree that if you detach the sensory things, then you're liable to have spiritual experiences. And for me, for instance, I very, very rare spiritual experiences, but I can think. I can detach my thinking from spirit, from the dimensionality that's implicit in this mind.
I think we have time for one quick comment.
Okay, well, a comment that this is a pure question.
Yes.
A few years ago, I got interested, obsessed, kind of, I guess, with a problem that in the philosophy of mind they call the hard problem of consciousness.
Indeed.
Physical forces come up from physical processes and come into something that approaches the brain, approaches the mind. And somehow or other, they become translated into symbols. Right now, if they come up, it's simply biochemical, neurological, whatever. but it will never turn out to be loyalty, goodness, the body does not generate in encoded form values, okay? So it interfaces with the brain, which has this spiritual input. I'm thinking it will never be solved by science why we have concepts in the brain, because we will never be able to reduce them to biophysical processes. But what if the body itself had a preliminary encoding process? So there was some spiritual substance which was in matter, which simultaneously helped to produce at the interface between the body and the mind a codable impression that could be picked up by the mind.
So you don't need spiritual things. Matter by itself, as I'm trying to do it, all matter follows the laws of quantum physics. So I'm saying that's enough to establish an interface.
But how can that be?
Because that's the way that discrete degrees are set up.
It sounds like a good conversation for
Yes,
lunchtime.
we'll continue later.
It must be a